In the case of physical reincarnation, you can choose to reincarnate either in the present or in the past or in the future. You're not limited to just incarnating in future, so-called future lifetimes relative to the time construct. The business of karma, which some people call a law, actually isn't a law. It's a choice which your higher self tends to make based upon your soul path and your progress as to what it is you need in order to progress spiritually. And in general, it's natural for you, if you've been an abuser, to choose to be an abused, or the alternative extremes of different polarizations and experiences. Generally speaking, by the time people have gained enough wisdom and expressed enough love to have their frequency high enough to be able to ascend or graduate from one density level to another in a given reality, they've been kings and paupers, they've been rulers and ruled, they've been abusers and abused, they've been male and female, they've done all of those kinds of things. They can incarnate in a given realm at birth. They can also incarnate not at birth, by agreement with another soul who has incarnated at birth, such that they can exchange position in a given physical body or join another soul in combination in a given body, either at birth or at some point along the path of the life experience of that particular physical incarnation. So it's possible, for example, for you to decide that your next incarnation is going to be a 12-year-old 1,000 years ago, for example, or things like that. So there's a lot of flexibility in what can happen there in your choices. And it's possible for, as I say, multi-souls to incarnate together in the same physical incarnation and share the experience and contribute to it collectively. It's possible to advance from one density of consciousness, one frequency band, into another, into a higher one. But generally speaking, you can't do that until you raise your frequency by virtue of gaining more wisdom, which raises your frequency, and expressing more love, which also raises your frequency. You generally need both in order to advance from one frequency band to another, raising your frequency higher until you can perceive and operate in a higher density. You can choose to incarnate in a lower density from a higher density. When you do that, you, generally speaking, will need to come in on the same basis as others coming into that experience, namely essentially checking your memory at the door when you come in and getting it back when you leave. And generally speaking, you need to reduce your vibration from a higher, or your frequency band, if you will, your consciousness band, from a higher level to a lower one, in order to incarnate on the same terms as everyone else, to reduce your operating frequency to match that of the lower density band. It is possible, if you're from a higher frequency realm, to incarnate without doing that, but if you do that, generally speaking, you're not really allowed to do anything in that density other than observe. Obviously, if that weren't the case, a higher density, more capable, more aware individual could come in and just dominate everything that was done in the lower density, and that's basically not allowed because of the desire to maintain free will on the part of those that are experiencing the lower density experience. So those are some of the features of the rules, so to speak, or possibilities that are typical in physical incarnations. What's going on right now in the Earth third dimensional human experience is, generally speaking, something called the law of confusion is being maintained. What that means is that you will not find any source giving you all of the answers that would produce the wisdom that you might eventually get through those experiences, because part of what you're seeking to do is to develop discrimination and judgment and wisdom. And so you can get information from higher density sources, by telepathic communication with the lower density individual, either your own lower density self from a higher density or someone else's, serving as a guide or a so-called guardian angel or things like that. In the third dimensional experience, there is polarity consciousness. Generally speaking, individuals have not decided until they graduate from the third density into the fourth and get their frequency high enough to do that, to ascend. They, generally speaking, have not decided until the end of a training cycle, so to speak, and we'll talk about the duration of training cycles shortly, but they haven't decided until the end of that cycle what polarization to take. And by polarization, I mean a positive polarization would be a person who decides to choose service to others over service to self, and love of others rather than just love of self. That's positive polarization. Negative polarization is the opposite of that, where you choose service to self and over service to others, and in addition to that, selfishness, just love of self rather than, generally speaking, love of others. In above the third density, there is polarity consciousness in the fourth and fifth density, but of consciousness, there are separate experiences for those who ascend into those frequency bands. That is, if you ascend via a choice of polarization of negative consciousness above the third density, ascending into the fourth, you end up in negatively polarized space-time, a negatively polarized space-time environment in fourth density, where only those who have chosen negative polarization are occupying that particular construct or theater. Similarly, if you choose positive polarization, you end up in positively polarized space-time. So unlike the third density, where both polarizations are present as part of a choice process, above third density is polarized one direction or the other in the experiences, and they're separate. The biblical descriptions, for example, of the separation of the goats and the sheep, so to speak, is about negative and positive polarization. The discussion about the wheat and the chaff is a discussion about the portion of humanity that at a given end of a cycle is ready for the so-called harvest and is operating at a frequency where they can actually advance from third density to fourth. Part of the third dimensional human experience is linearity, where things tend to operate linearly. Time operates linearly generally. There are exceptions to that. And linear consciousness tends to be successful. That is, plotting a plan where your so-called left brain side, your rational side, is picking a path and moving along a path, and it seems to work. Above third density, the dimensional experiences tend to be nonlinear, where everything's happening synchronistically, and you can't actually plot a path linearly that works. Linearity is not characteristic of fourth, fifth, etc., higher densities. There's an experience typically in the third density and the third dimensional human experience of feeling separate and alone. You tend until very nearly your graduation point of getting your frequency high enough to not realize that everything actually is interconnected, and we're all part of the greater whole. Physical reincarnation is a feature that's available in the third density all the way, and is typical of the third dimensional experience, all the way up until the seventh density experience. Eighth density experience, there is incarnation, so-called in a body, so to speak, but it doesn't really have any physicality. It just has form. As you move up more and more from third density through fourth, fifth, etc., you find that those incarnations have less and less matter associated with the physicality and more light. And things start to look more and more like they're lit from within, because they're comprised increasingly of light and less of matter. By the 7th density, you're talking very little matter in physicality there, mostly light. By the 8th density, there is no matter there. There's just everything's comprised of light. So those are sort of some characteristics of these things. Karma is typically a feature that's applicable in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th densities, and is present therefore in the 3rd dimensional experience. There's a tendency to feel, because these frequency bands higher and higher involve higher and higher awareness and higher capabilities on the part of the beings that occupy those higher dimensions. There's a tendency to feel that because of those higher capabilities and higher frequency levels, which are more capable, that a 3rd dimensional human incarnation is sort of the kindergarten of experiences. Actually, it's the reverse. Because people are so much less aware, it's much more difficult for them to graduate, to raise their frequency, for them to realize what's going on, raise their frequency, and graduate from the 3rd dimension that it is the 4th, 5th, 6th, etc. And so the 3rd dimensional experience is basically the master course. It doesn't matter if you come in from a higher dimension and have lowered your frequency down and come into the 3rd dimension. The idea that it's duck soup for you to raise your frequency again and get out of there is completely specious. Only the brave do that because it's possible for them to get stuck there for a very long time going around the loops, especially in the kind of scenario which we've come to experience on Earth, where our lifetimes are relatively short. At one time in the Earth experience, the lifetime of humans was more like 800 or 900 years. Today it's 60, 70, 80, maybe up to 100 years, very few more than that, and it's much more difficult to gain wisdom and understanding and raise your frequency to get out of here when you have a relatively short lifetime and you keep coming in with less awareness. As the frequency of the planet rises, and it in fact itself goes through graduation into higher densities, then it starts to be able to support higher frequency consciousness here, and it becomes a little easier for people to come in here and get out of here if they're coming from a higher dimension, because they're able to come in with more consciousness and still match what's present in the frequency band as it approaches its upper limits of the 3rd dimensional frequency band. So there's a sort of a synopsis of what the 3rd dimensional human experience is. Talking about what the history has been here in the 3rd dimensional Earth. The Earth basically, first of all, you'll see in my slide here I talk about histories, not history, and the reason being that actually while the operating system for 3rd dimensional Earth is defined by the collective consciousness that is having the experience, the individual experiences are all different, and people also, first of all, they view the experience through the lens of their own understanding, which is changing as they're doing incarnations. There are commonalities. For example, if you see the color yellow, unless you're colorblind, we can all agree that the color yellow is yellow, but you don't know whether my yellow is your yellow, and you never will. We view the experience through the lens of our own perception as it changes in frequency and experience, and as we accumulate baggage also over time from previous experiences. Earth itself was created as a training ground for humanity, basically, and it's been here for a very long time. It goes through cycles that are designed to be ideal training experiences as a theater for souls to gain evolution and appreciation in higher frequencies. So it was created here as a training ground for humanity. There have been numerous humanoids here over the history of the planet, not only humanity, but various hybrids and various so-called ETs that have been present here in varying degrees and have contributed to the hybridization of the physical human vehicle that has been operating here. And when I say contributed, sometimes contributed less than positively. For example, the fact that the human lifetime has shrunken rather than expanded has come about in part because of the human collective and individual behavior, but in part because of redesign by some who considered it advantageous for humans not to progress and to become enslaved to their oversight. There have been many civilizations on Earth. We have been classically taught that we're the highest civilization that's ever been here, that the Earth has been here for 6 billion years or so, is the classical view, based upon bad science, I might add. Usually things like analytical processes, such as looking at processes that people have assumed scientifically are linear processes, such as radioactive decay. Those are not linear processes, as it turns out. They typically, in our time, have been perceived to be linear, but actually, if you go back through time, you would find that those processes have changed in their activity and are capable of being changed in their activity. And therefore, the ancient civilization dating processes are typically flawed. The numbers are different than they think. Anyway, there have been many civilizations here over history, and typically what's happened is that humanity and the occupancy here has been brought in here as a training ground, transplanted in some way as refugees from elsewhere, and gone through many cycles. And there are a certain number of cycles that are devoted to the civilization, in which it typically will start off in the hunter-gatherer range and move up through agrarian civilizations, and then the development of technology and all of that. And we're in the very late stages of a set of cycles like that, where typically what has happened in the past is, as the civilization has evolved to more and more technology and more understanding in a linear sense, it has become more and more at odds with itself and with the planet. And typically those civilizations have then ended and not continued. There is evidence on the planet now being discovered in this time, as it has been discovered in other cycles in the past, that is showing that actually civilization has been here many times, and we're not even yet the highest evolved civilization that has been here. There have been civilizations more highly evolved than ours technologically, which have been extinguished, and in our time right now there is evidence being uncovered which for the most part hasn't been shown to the public. There are pieces of it leaking out which are showing that there have been higher tech civilizations here that our classical educational system has not been aware of or has not been teaching. And typically civilizations have risen and waned and gone through cycles, rather than many civilizations, rather than one evolution in which finally we're the highest evolution that has existed on this planet and maybe in the universe, which is actually quite ridiculous. There are many higher civilizations in the universe than ours, and many higher ones that have been, a number of higher ones that have been here in the past. The Earth's histories have involved many evolutionary cycles, as I say, and I'll talk more about how that works shortly. And there are numerous archetypal experiences which have occurred in the so-called Earth histories. One of the reasons I say Earth histories is, as I say, it's possible to incarnate back in time, and you can come into the Earth history by incarnating back in time as a soul, you do not change what has happened here, because in fact what has happened here in the past has served many souls and becomes part of the so-called Akashic record, which is not changeable, and essentially that information exists going forward ad nauseum. But if you go back and you incarnate, let's suppose you went back, as has happened, to the Civil War time and Lincoln's time, and you incarnate there, and you decide to experience life from there, you do not change what has happened, you create a parallel track. And for that reason, there are Earth histories, not Earth history. And there are, in this time of progressive enlightenment occurring on the planet, evidences of the fact that there have been histories, in that some of us that are here right now can remember that we experienced certain things which are being categorized right now as the Mandela effect, where, for example, Nelson Mandela, for some of us, is remembered to have passed on in prison in South Africa in the late 80s, early 90s, and yet in another version of history, which is part of the current reality, so to speak, or current theater that we're experiencing now, he appeared to have gotten out of prison, and there's a different outcome. And there are many people on the planet that have actually shifted realities and remember a different history there. The same thing's true with another 8 or 10 or more specific things that were experienced widely by people. Kit Kat candy bars having a dash in the middle of the logo, whereas if you go to Kit Kat today, it doesn't have a dash, and they will tell you it's never had a dash in this reality. And little things like that. So there are histories, and the idea that given things have happened on Earth at the archetypal experiences, major experiences like the existence of a civilization called Atlantis, which in fact there was on the planet, despite many believing that was myth. The timing of things in that history varies depending upon which layer of experience you were in. And we actually change layers continually to minor degrees, generally not major degrees. So in archetypal experiences, you will find that there are different histories in which things happen, generally in certain time frames, but there are different specifics as to when things happen when it comes down to what the people on the planet right now are experiencing, or have experienced. Earth itself is, as I've said, a conscious living system, and it's approximately 8 billion years old, which is a different number than you will hear from mainstream science, primarily because the dating approaches are different. But again, that's approximately because it's differing in different realities, not massively among the various realities so far, but it's approximately 8 billion years old. This is an idealization of the solar system, a cartoon of it, so to speak, from the Space Place on the NASA website, and it shows the sun and the various planets going out. There is, of course, an asteroid belt that's well known, and if you look at that asteroid belt, it's been a puzzlement as to why there's all this debris there. In fact, at one time, the asteroid belt was a planet in this solar system. And that planet was destroyed by technology and warfare some several 100,000 years ago. And it was a planet that was quite large, physically large, relative to the other planets. The planet that was the asteroid belt was named Maldek. Maldek was a planet about half the size of Jupiter, big planet. And the solar system was quite different in those days. Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, and a smaller planetoid called Ceres, which is on the edge of the asteroid belt, were all former moons of Maldek. They were satellites of Maldek, and they ended up being relocated prior to the destruction of Maldek. Maldek actually became a highly evolved civilization with lots of technology, lots of warfare technology, and warfare developed in the solar system back and forth, the equivalent of a Star Wars. And nearly all of the planets in our solar system right now were participants in that warfare, in that they were influenced and impacted by that warfare. In the case of Maldek, ultimately Maldek was entirely destroyed by nuclear weapons that were set at various positions simultaneously on the planet and created a resonance that caused the planet to implode. And that created destruction to other planets as well. It was known at some levels by some on the planet that would happen, and certainly known in higher dimensions that would happen. And there was actually a higher dimensional intervention that prevented its moons from being destroyed with it. And actually Ceres, Mars, Earth, Venus, and Mercury were relocated in the solar system to prevent their destruction at the point at which Maldek then subsequently became destroyed. So there was a higher dimensional intervention with higher dimension technology that acted to preserve those things so that they weren't all destroyed with Maldek. There are interventions by higher dimensions that actually higher dimensional authorities, so to speak, that look at and monitor what's going on in this training ground and sometimes intervene to prevent things which are counterproductive to the whole learning process. Maldek was allowed to be destroyed as a learning process, but no other planet in the solar system will be allowed to be destroyed, or it wasn't productive to allow that, because if in fact anyone needed that soul expression, they could go back and incarnate on Maldek and have it. But basically at the time that Maldek was here and prior to its destruction, this solar system had more than one sun. Saturn at that time was a sun in this solar system. It became a planet by virtue of its axis being interfered with by the destruction and implosion of Maldek. Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, Jupiter were all impacted by the catastrophe at Maldek. So anyway, the history's been very different. Earth is one of the few planets in the solar system that was not severely damaged by Maldek. Venus, Mars have scars on them. Mars was damaged considerably by the destruction of Maldek, and a lot of the debris from the destruction of Maldek actually was hauled off by another celestial body coming through the solar system and sweeping away a lot of the debris with it, carrying it away gravitationally. The position with regard to the various satellites relative to the sun was changed. This is all a very different history than people have been told. Certainly very different than NASA has implied, which has fairly consistently up until recently indicated, there's no evidence of life in the solar system really. It's pretty barren and everything, and only really recently has begun to talk about discoveries of water in various places. Ganymede is the moon of Jupiter, etc., having water, and water being elsewhere on Mars and elsewhere. But actually those things have been known for some time by NASA as well. And the history of the solar system is very different than we've been told. So, what has been happening on this planet? For a long time now, the planet has been descending into darkness. More and more of the few seeking to control and enslave the many has been implemented to such a point that by 2016, the control of a few over the many on this population had almost been perfected at that time via a wide variety of techniques involving deceit and enslavement of various types. In this time, the frequency of the planet is rising. As it rises, deceit becomes more and more hard to sustain, because in the rising frequency, there's more awareness, people are waking up, and today, deceit, corruption, and dysfunctionality are being exposed more and more. And it looks like, to many, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, but actually that has been the case, that there has been deceit, corruption, and dysfunctionality historically for a very long time without people really recognizing it or wanting to see it. As things have become more and more extreme, it becomes more and more apparent. And in this slide, you're looking at all kinds of categories and federal agencies and institutions that have become very corrupt and the basis of a great deal of deceit, and it has become widespread with regard to their being dishonest and serving the few and not serving the many. Basically, economically in this time, all of the marbles are rolling into one corner. Here you're looking at a slide that's based on data from Piketty and Saez, economists from University of California, Berkeley, in which you're able to see that between the year 2000 and 2006, the prosperity has become extremely uneven. There's more and more of the increase in prosperity going to the top 1/100th of 1% of the population, their share of the prosperity increasing by 22%. At the other extreme, the bottom 90% of the US economy has shrunken by 4% in terms of the benefits to the bottom 90% of the workforce. Very little of it has gone anywhere but to the top few percent, those in the society. So economically, everything is flowing into one corner. There has been a great deal of income inequality over the history between the data that started with the IRS in 1930, showing how much of the pre-tax income was going where, and between there and 2007, again, the Piketty and Saez data plotted using the IRS data, which was created for a different purpose and therefore was available and wasn't corrupted, showing that the top 1% share of the pre-tax income by 1928 had grown to something like 23 or 24% of all of the income was going to the top 1%. That was, of course, immediately prior to the stock market crash of 1929. When all of the marbles roll into one corner, the economy becomes problematic because the top 1% or so, they don't buy much. You know, you bought 2 or 3 pairs of designer jeans. I mean, how many do you need? You don't buy your rateable share of all the economic purchases, and it isn't actually investment per se which drives the economy. It's purchasing of stuff that drives the economy. And so as more and more of the economic benefit rolls into one corner, there becomes less and less of that income that's actually creating an economy by creating demand. After the stock market crash in 1929, it settled back because of the Great Depression. And then eventually, and it shrank back to where only 10% or so of the benefit was going to the top 1%, and then gradually began to increase until by 2007 it was almost back to the same point at which the stock market crash had occurred. And of course there was a crisis in the financial markets. The US chose to bail out, or the US political system, I should say, chose to bail out the banks, but without actually changing any requirements of what they were really allowed to do. And that has become more extreme since. So the economy is again becoming problematic as more and more of the benefit goes to fewer and fewer people. So we're actually in a time frame right now where there's an economic tailspin going on, where unemployment has reached in excess of 20% since 2009. If you listen to the news media, you would get a completely different impression because they're only talking about the U3 component of unemployment. And there are other components that are not being included in the data. For example, if a person's been unemployed for more than a year, there's now an assumption on the part of the reporting authorities that, those people obviously don't want to work if they haven't worked in a year, but in fact they're just chronically unemployed. And when you consider how much of the employment base is unemployed, the numbers are in excess of 20% now, and has been since 2009. Inflation was redefined, contrary to the awareness of most of the public, even though it's public information. Inflation was redefined in 1980 as to the mechanism by which they reported cost of living increases. They started changing the calculation and what was being included in 1980 and again in 1990, making it less and less relevant to actually what's going on. If you look at the old data, such as John Williams is an economist, Amos Tuck scholar from Dartmouth, who has been following and reporting that the original data calculations continuing for comparison, you find that if you looked at what was the more relevant calculations, he's shown that inflation has been averaging in the vicinity of 10% since 2007, and most of that even since 2000. The economy is shrinking yearly, contrary to what the government has been reporting, because again, they changed the way they were calculating the GDP, and it's been shrinking yearly, an average of about 2% since 2001. So basically, we're in an economic tailspin. The public has been largely aware of that from their personal experience, where they're finding everything's tougher and tougher. And we have basically approximately half of the employment base of the United States now in poverty class in this time. The economy is being hollowed out big time. It's unsustainable. These were all things that happened out of the inherent structure of the banking system, which is a fractional reserve system in which if you in fact use a system like that where you're only required to maintain a fraction of the assets that you're handling being your own equity and the rest of it is all borrowings, eventually you get caught in a downturn where your equity gets wiped out if in fact you have your customers coming and asking for their money. Basically, the fractional reserve banking system is one in which the banks are borrowing money on the short term and lending it out long term. They get caught in that problem when the public confidence reduced in the Great Depression and they got, quote, bailed out in that time, the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which was essentially a federal institution as an insurance against that kind of problem run on the banks, that was being funded by a small amount of funding from the banking system itself. But they actually have never had in the FDIC more than 2 or 3% of the total asset exposure provided to them via the system. And you go in your local bank and it says your deposits up to $250,000 are insured by the full fate of the United States. That's only true to the extent of a few percent. Congress has never funded the FDIC to the extent of its entire liabilities. If you had an industrial corporation that had all of its liabilities as short-term liabilities and all of its assets were only available to it in the long term, such as mortgage payments and all of that, it would be judged by the generally accepted accounting rules as being insolvent. However, they adopted different banking conventions for the banking system itself. That structure inherently, heads I win, tails you lose. We push off the liabilities to the public at large and the government if we get in trouble, and when we're not in trouble, we're paying you a tiny amount for your money and we're getting a large amount for our money, and it's inevitable that all the marbles roll into one corner with a system like that. And to additionally complicate the situation, we have a federal bank, the Federal Reserve System, actually owned by the banks, and the financial policies of the government being determined by the banks, fox in charge of the chickens. Under a system like that, it's inevitable that the few will control the many, and they'll end up with all the assets. We have, because of all that concentration of wealth and the political influences now upon the political system, the essential hijacking of the international political, administrative, and judicial systems because of the influence of money, and the progressive monopolization of the control of media, commercial, and financial systems by the financial interests. So as the marbles roll into one corner, basically that creates an economic tailspin. It's unsustainable. So that was nearly perfected by the year 2016. Now, because of the effects of that, more and more people have become uncomfortable, and more people are waking up, and it will be changed. The tremendous influence of money on all of the systems nowadays has also created a lot of distraction, intentional distraction, I would submit to you, of the public, in order to avoid people really focusing on what's happening. And you have what some call weapons of mass distraction occurring, which are things like terrorism and mass shootings and political drama, wars and threats of nuclear war, environmental disasters, scandals, racism, bureaucratic requirements such as the whole tax system, weather disasters, which in fact there's technology now that has been misused in recent times to literally create weather disasters, as the technology became capable of doing that in order to serve as weapons of mass distraction, as more and more of the control flowed to the few. So, this has been a time when everything is becoming unsustainable, but the good news out of it is everybody's starting to wake up. That ensures that it will change, and it is changing now. The problem isn't new. There have been many deceits and manipulations throughout history which have been different from what the public has been told. The Kennedy assassination being one well-known one, the Iraq invasion, existence as I've described it with the FDIC, the reasons for the Vietnam War and its conduct, the whole 9/11 debacle. None of those things were what they were being represented, and they served to create public support for losing rights, basically, by changing laws and infringing more and more of people's capacities and walking off with more and more of the world's financial system and reducing controls that prevented that. As I say, all of this is now changing. What's new isn't that these problems are just starting to exist recently. What's new is that people are waking up, and that ensures their change. So, who's the culprit? It actually isn't the few controlling the many, it's us. We have met the enemy, and they is us, as the Pogo cartoon of the 50s or early 60s proclaimed. Basically, the fact that the public has been willing to allow these things to happen by virtue of the choices that it's made toward the valuation of money and stuff, and being seduced by consumerism and not really paying attention to what was going on in the political and industrial side, and leaving the job to other people to monitor those things and assuming they would do the right things. In fact, they haven't. But basically, the culprit has been our lack of involvement and insistence on things being done rightly, and the values that we have been treasuring, increasingly materialism and less participation in the more fundamental creation of values. There is an emerging awareness now that we are individually and collectively responsible for creating our experience. And this actually goes beyond political participation and all that. It actually comes down to the physics of how everything really works. We really are creating this experience, and we'll talk about how that works. So, what's happening? One of the major things that's happening in this time is that there is a rising frequency of this planet itself, and the planet itself as a living system is ascending from the third density into the fourth. If you look at this graphic here, it's a NASA graphic showing the Milky Way galaxy, and you can see down here at about 6 o'clock, you're looking at the spiral configuration of the stars in our galaxy, and in the center the galactic sun, and down about 6 o'clock, halfway between there and the edge of the galaxy, is our sun, which is rotating over time around the Milky Way galaxy. How does evolution actually happen on the planet? As I said, the Earth is now rising in frequency to become a fourth density enterprise, actually. How does it all work? Basically, there's an evolutionary information flow. This whole phenomenon of information fields or idea fields or thought fields actually flows in a certain hierarchy. It comes from the source, goes through the universal suns, and I say suns because there are multiple universes, but in this universe it goes through its universal sun to the galactic suns, is a flow of that information. From there to the suns that are the stars around which the solar systems are constructed. From those stars, in our case our sun, to the planetary suns. Actually, the planets themselves have a sun within them, in which there's an information flow that's coming from the sun that's the basis of our solar system through the planetary suns, and from there percolates out to the surfaces of the planet through various portals. And that's actually the way that information is flowing, generally speaking. And actually everything that's happening evolution-wise is being programmed by the source through those roots in such a way that things are changing with time. Here you're looking at a schematic that is taking the Milky Way galaxy as the basis, and I have added to that a schematic, if you will, or a cartoon showing different colors, just to distinguish them for visual purposes, different colors of radial information bands. And essentially the center of the Milky Way galaxy's sun is at the center here with the stars rotating about them in these spirals, and they're rotating around that sun, our sun being, as I say, halfway between the middle and the edge at about the 6 o'clock position. And it is shown here schematically for illustration purposes, just about to move or just moving from one information field band that is a band of information coming out from the center of the galaxy radially into another information field band, which is a different program, a higher frequency band that is causing a raising of the frequency of our solar system and any other star systems that are moving into that band. And that happens over time. That's actually the flow of information, and everything basically is about programming. The operating systems of the stars and the planets and the different venues, different galaxies, etc., are programs that come through those roots, and they vary with time. If you recall back to the illustration of reality versus the constructs all are based upon programs, information field programs that cause their manifestation and cause their change with time. And we're in a time in the Earth and also on other planets in our solar system in which they are moving into this different higher frequency band which will be interpreted as a more energetic band and tend to be interpreted as increases in temperature and energy and activity within anything that's moving into the new band. This is being observed in the Earth. It's been somewhat misinterpreted as global warming caused by the greenhouse effect. While we have had some effect upon the Earth that has not been helpful with the greenhouse gases, the fact of the matter is the Earth would be going through an increase in energy and a change in evolutionary pattern right now, even if man weren't on the planet and even if we weren't burning fossil fuels. So anyway, there are operating systems changing, there are dimensional systems, there are dimensional shifts occurring, such as our planet moving into the fourth density and becoming a fourth density enterprise. There are regeneration cycles that are programmed through that flow that I've described. The Earth actually goes through a regeneration cycle periodically. And people living on the planet in this day are increasingly admonishing us to save the Earth. The fact of the matter is the Earth saves itself periodically, and that's not to abdicate in any way our responsibility at being in harmony with the planet. And as was demonstrated with Maldek, it is possible for us to destroy a planet, at least to a point, after which you may well see, and we do see, higher dimensional interventions to prevent too much idiocy from going on, to ruin the effort altogether for what is actually a training ground. But anyway, the Earth does regenerate itself periodically. The history of the Earth has been mankind moving up from, as I say, hunter-gatherer to agrarian to starting the creations of technologies and evolving and becoming more and more with its odds in itself and the planet getting up like a big wet dog, so to speak, shaking itself and driving everything back to the Stone Age. That's been more or less the history that has gone on here. It is a cycle, a set of cycles, as we'll talk about further in a moment, that occurs, which has a purpose of allowing humanity and life forms to operate here and evolve and eventually move their frequencies high enough that they too, like the Earth, are capable of advancing to a higher frequency band, a higher consciousness state, and greater degrees of harmony. So evolution of species also occurs in this way, and in fact there has been considerable science now in our time which is proving that DNA can be evolved by information fields and can do so very readily. I'm very familiar personally with some of that work, and some of that I was formerly partnered with one of the leading former Soviet physicists at the time I knew him. The Soviet Union had already dissolved, in which he showed me work which the Russians had done, demonstrating, for example, that in one generation you could use information fields to take, for example, a chicken egg, expose it to the information from ducks, and in one generation produce offspring that had webbed feet and flat bills. And there's been other excellent work showing that DNA is programmable, and that what programs it and changes it is information fields. Information fields are thought fields. We have thoughts. We are actually capable and do, either constructively or destructively, reprogram our own DNA from time to time, sometimes devolving and having genetic deficiencies passed on to future generations as well as our own, sometimes evolving. But even aside from all of that, the cosmos itself and the source and the universe is, on a more general basis, reprogramming the DNA in these times. Our DNA is changing right now for the better, for the most part, by virtue of the new program coming in right now, radially out of the galactic sun. There are species leaving the planet. People have been very well aware that we're losing species in the planet and talking about how destructive we've been. And we have been destructive. I don't disagree with that at all. But the fact of the matter is there are also species arriving on the planet in these times. Most people don't hear about that. But a decade or more ago, there had been more than 200 new species identified in the Mekong Valley alone in Asia, in Vietnam area, and in Papua New Guinea, more than 250 new species were coming in at that point. That wasn't our misbehavior, that was reprogramming that's occurring in this time. All the life forms actually do evolve by virtue of programming that comes from the central source. Our bodies are changing in these times. Our cells are changing. Our cells are actually liquid crystals. They have liquid in them, mostly water, water-based systems. Water has been found in these time frames, work done by people very close to me in the scientific community. One of my best friends who did a lot of work in this area, Penn State, and there are many others who have contributed importantly around the world, noticing that water is programmable by thoughts. The work of Masaru Emoto in Japan demonstrated this. Many people were skeptical about that. There was work which reproduced those principles, working also with Emoto by the Institute of Noetic Sciences, very good science. That technical effort headed up by the chief scientist there, Dean Radin, showing that in fact water is programmable and that you can change the structure of water via programs. Our cells are programmable. They're changing in crystallizations. They're actually liquid crystals. They're changing in crystallizations to a higher frequency crystallization. Our bodies are changing right now via the programming to begin to transition from carbon-based life forms towards silicon-based life forms. So the chemistry is changing, our DNA is changing, everything's changing right now. The Earth has programmed ascension windows, which have been part of the training system of this training ground or theater, so to speak, for souls to come in and incarnate. They're fundamentally 25,000 year interim cycles, and every 3 of those interim cycles, there's this, essentially you reach a 75,000 year grand cycle, at which the Earth then goes through a regeneration cycle and regenerates itself, and basically brings itself back to a pristine state, and humanity is incarnated into this realm to go through its training cycles for the purposes of spiritual development and eventual evolution and ascension to higher levels. We are right now at the end of a grand cycle. There's grand cycles, as I say, are part of these programs that come through, as I've described it, these radio programs coming out of the central sun of the galaxy. And we're at the end of a grand cycle in which there's an ascension window. The Earth itself is moving up in frequency, and in order to stay with the current Earth, we have to actually rise in frequency sufficiently by the end of that grand cycle to be able to operate in the 4th density. And there is a portion, well, there's a general increase in frequency on this planet, and there's a portion of the population on the planet that will in fact ascend from 3rd density Earth into the 4th density Earth. The first cycle of this latest grand cycle that occurred beginning 75,000 years ago actually had, at the end of that 25,000 years, there was a window in which humanity could in fact ascend from the 3rd density to the 4th. The yield of that interim cycle was 0. That is, there was nobody in the population of the Earth at that time that ascended, which was surprising considering this is a training ground intended to have a yield. At the 50,000 year point in that cycle, the yield was 150 people out of the population of millions on the planet at that time, not billions at that point, but millions. And there were only 150 that came to that point. Those 150 were capable of ascending to the 4th density. They in fact did ascend in their capacity to operate in the 4th density, but then basically were offered the opportunity to remain in order to help increase the yield of the last of the 75,000 year cycle that's ending now. They did, to a person, remain in order to assist with that. At risk to themselves, but they did. And we are now at the end of the next 25,000 year cycle, which is the end of the grand cycle. There have historically been veils which were imposed over the earth to prevent full awareness of humanity. Those veils made it more difficult for humanity to go within and connect with their higher awareness while those veils were in place. And part of the reason for that was that humanity, with its full awareness, has tremendous capacities to do all kinds of things, but that segment that was third dimensional segment incarnated here certainly lacked the wisdom and the perspective that would have made them dangerous. If they had their full capacities, they could have created a lot of havoc while they were here. So there were actually veils which amounted to a technology that was being used that came from the Sirius star system and was brought here to sustain a number of layers of veils over the planet to slow down the capacity to evolve until they caught up with it spiritually. Right now, in our time, those veils are progressively being removed, making it easier for people to rise in consciousness and ascend than it has been before. One of the reasons why that is feasible also is that the planetary frequency is now rising, and if you're going to stay on this planet, you have to be, it's now actually, as of 2016, the Earth has become a fourth density consciousness enterprise. If you want to continue to be on the Earth, you have to rise in frequency to do that. Either you will rise in frequency or you will not be on the planet because it's ascending. The veils are now being removed. We ourselves reflect the properties of the Creator. The properties of the Creator, as I mentioned earlier, are omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence. We actually, as a spiritual being, as spiritual beings, actually reflect those same qualities. We have tremendous capacity to actually create and manifest virtually anything you could imagine with our full awareness. We're nothing like our full awareness at the moment, but that is the reflection of omnipotence. We have capacity to literally know everything as we connect with our higher self, and the evolution of the technology of remote viewing was a means in our time of demonstrating the reality of that statement. We can, by things like meditation, accomplish the same thing, albeit it may take a lifetime or lifetimes to do it. There are also technologies, such as I showed you recently in this presentation, such as a light field, that are training wheels that help you to regain that capacity faster than spending a lifetime in meditation. We also reflect omnipresence, meaning that we're actually present everywhere, and there are aspects of our spiritual consciousness that are in all dimensions of existence of every universe and having experiences there, albeit we tend to have those experiences as compartmentalized ones, unconnected with what we're doing here in the third dimension. Here you see a slide showing the moon with the Earth, and this is a NASA Deep Space Climate Observatory picture of the Earth and the moon, although it really isn't, in the respect that here in this picture you would be seeing the backside of the moon. That's not what the backside of the moon looks like, because it's been retouched by the powers that be, so that you're not really seeing what the backside of the moon looks like. It looks quite different than that. But fundamentally, the moon itself has been here for a long time. It has not always been here. Conventional theories of how it got here, that it was formed at the time that the Earth was formed via some impact, or was blown out of the surface of the Earth and became a satellite, or it was captured passing by the Earth's gravity. All of those things are now known, and I'm sure they're known by NASA, to be false. None of those actually are how the moon got there. The moon was at one time a verdant planetoid somewhere, not in our solar system, which because of warfare became a so-called dead planet. It's alive at some level, as everything is, such as atoms and things like that, but as a living planetoid, consciousness no longer is functional. It has much hollow space within it that is actually occupied by higher dimensional beings and off-planet beings that are monitoring what's going on here and operating the technologies that include formation of the veils that actually have encircled the Earth. And those veils are now purposely being lifted. That technology is being exercised differently to lift those veils. But those veils exist because of the moon. And the moon actually was brought here from elsewhere. It was towed here. It has not always been here, and it will not always be here. But presently it is. So it's actually known ever since NASA visited the moon, and even with the flawed means of determining ages, on a comparative basis they were right, that in fact they noticed that the rocks on the moon were older than the Earth. And they were scratching their heads over that, at least publicly. And in fact, that's evidence of the fact the moon was not originally here. It was brought here as a technology and as a monitoring station and laboratory. I once met Jay Keyworth, who at the time that I met him was President Reagan's science advisor. He was a very straight shooter. I briefed him on some technology that I was involved in. He was, in my judgment, a very competent and honest straight shooter, as evidenced by this quote, which is very interesting. I think there was before a quote and testimony of Dr. Keyworth before the 99th Congress in 1985, in which he said, quote, "All government agencies lie part of the time, but NASA is the only one I've ever encountered that does so routinely." And I thought that was a wonderful quote. In fact, NASA has hidden a tremendous amount of the knowledge that we've gotten out of our space program as to what really has been going on here in our solar system. Now bits of that are starting to come out increasingly because everything's coming out, and I think they're trying to get ahead of the curve a little bit before they would be subjected to a huge firestorm of criticism as all the information eventually comes out, showing that they've been hiding a lot of truth that actually shows a completely different history of the solar system and of what's going on here, that would reveal to us really the kind of things that I'm talking about. But now increasingly the information is leaking out. There are about 35,000 employees of NASA, and they really couldn't depend upon all those employees to be willing to hide the truth. And this time the truth is coming out. What's happening? Well, among other things, the solar brilliance, which NASA is well aware of, is off the charts right now. The sun is becoming brighter and brighter. I've often been astounded by the amount of people that I've run into that haven't noticed that the sun's changed. It used to be bright yellow white. Now it is brilliant white and contains more high frequencies, UV and other things coming off of it. That is part of the change that's occurring as we're moving into this new band, and it's being programmed with a different outcome. This program is part of the whole change that is occurring in this time of the rising frequency of the planet. And as I mentioned to you, everything in this so-called physical reality is metaphorical. The metaphor of the brighter sun is the brighter light of truth coming, of truth and love, coming into the planet and causing, by a matter of frequency and programming, more and more to be revealed, in which everything's been revealed. All the misbehavior and everything else is coming out. It's becoming impossible on this planet to deceive people anymore. It's all coming out and will come out because of the higher frequency program.